Man, oh man, I know why I love that song, but Matt, tell us why that's your standout track from the album.
It's difficult not to pick it, right? Because
Yeah.
I think that the album Blue Lines there are kind of 4 fence posts that the rest of the fence hangs on, right? There's the opening track, Safe from Harm, then track 3 I think is Blue Lines, then we have Unfinished Sympathy, and then the Hymn of the Big Wheel is how it finishes. And if you look at those 4 songs in isolation, that's the journey of the record, right? But Unfinished Sympathy stands out beyond that because it is an era-defining song.
Yeah.
Like, I find it weird now, and it's all because of what I mentioned at the start when I kind of was doing this kind of podcasters therapy thing. And
we'll bill you, don't worry.
We're talking about like how I view those things. And when I think of the 90s and the music and the sound of the 90s, for me, I don't hear the music I listen to. I don't get that nostalgic pang of songs that I listen to. And I've kind of almost just replaced it with this new headcanon. What I hear in my head is stuff like Venus is a Boy by Bjork, or Roads by Portishead, songs that I never would have listened to then, and this song as well. And they are songs that I think if you were to do even if you did like quite a shameless top 10 list of the songs of the 90s, it would be in there. Yeah. If you did a kind of a collection, or a more thoughtful collection of like pieces of art from the 1990s, this song would probably be in there. And if it wasn't, something that sounds like this would be.
Right.
And to me, it's what the 90s is. Also, it's a very strange song in terms of its construction. It does not have a bass line, which is odd, right? For a dance track to not have a bass line. It's like I really enjoyed like researching this, because now that the World Wide Web is quite popular and has its uses,
people love it.
You can find the provenance of samples, and I never knew where a lot of these samples came from. That kind of shuffling percussive drum beat is like actually from like an old blaxploitation movie, and they just like lifted it wholesale, stuck it in there. There's a piano line over the top. They've got a bell sound that they sampled onto an 808, and then they I think they recorded a synth string over the top, but it didn't have the right sound. So they actually like a fun fact, Nana Cherry and her husband pretty much funded the recording of this album that was mostly recorded in her house, right?
Yeah.
And Nana Cherry didn't realize this at the time, but like, you know, Buffalo Stance is a huge song, right? Yeah. If I think of the 80s, the late 80s, and like me being a kid, I remember that song being on the radio and that being one of my first exposures to A, hip hop, and B, like a woman singing hip hop, like, or being like a mixture of sounds, and she's kind of like British American kind of like mashup. It's quite an odd sounding record, but she name drops the Wild Bunch in that song. She says, "I'm hanging with the Wild Bunch," and I was like, "Oh, I don't know what that means," but now I know. It's these guys.
Yeah, because it could mean anything. It could just be like a placeholder word for a wild bunch of people, but this is the Wild Bunch with capital letters. Yeah,
she wasn't talking about. She's not a fan of the Sam Peckinpah movie, I would have thought. Or maybe she is.
She could have been, but no, not in this case.
Yeah. But yeah, they recorded the strings with like a real arrangement, a real kind of orchestra, and it really feels like it, doesn't it, when it kicks in. And like I said to you earlier, that moment where it rises up all the way and then just drops out for like 2 bars. It's just such a great, it's like, you know, going down that roller coaster and leaving your stomach behind. I just love that. Also the music video, a great one.
Yeah. Iconic.
Fantastic.
Oh. Yeah.
And prizes if you can spot all of the 3 MCs from Massive Attack popping up behind newsstands and stuff, like in the background.
I found 2 the last time I watched. I was able to find 2 of them.
Yeah, I think one of them's in a reflection of a window, I want to say. So yeah,
clever.
You've got to be
like Hitchcock.
Yeah, exactly. I really like, if you were to speak to the uninitiated about Massive Attack, right? Mm-hmm. Their 3 most famous songs feature guest vocalists, which I think is always kind of interesting. And they've always been really savvy They've always made really savvy choices about guest vocalists on Blue Lines, the album in particular. Shara Nelson, Horace Andy, Tricky, who was technically in the band then and kind of left and is kind of sort of a pseudo member or whatever. But then, like, if you think about the next album, Protection, the title track of that, Tracy Thorn's vocal on that is incredible. Elizabeth Fraser on Teardrop. Those 3 songs are probably Massive Attack's most famous songs, and none of them featured members of the band, which is kind of interesting.
Which contributes to that collectivist sort of ethos that we're talking about, right? Like, which does seem to be a really core, like a core part of their identity coming out of that sound system scene in Bristol. It feels like that had to have, for this to feel authentically Bristol, it has to feature that collective energy, is what I'm gathering.
Yeah, 100%. And it's the reason the album sounds so kind of diverse in terms of its musical stylings is because there is this openness and this playfulness that they kind of take these things from everywhere. And it's the ultimate mishmash album, I think, not in a kind of like girl talk type way, but like as in there's lots going on there, and it all feels an equal part of the whole, which I really like.
Is that the first time someone's dropped girl talk?
No, I think you get 3 million more points for invoking girl talk.
The very first episode of your show I listened to was the Avalanches album, Since I Left You, and the guy you had on talking about that talked about girl talk.
Oh, okay, that makes sense. Of course, Evan talked about girl talk.
Well, you get 6 million points now for citing your sources, for knowing the canon better than we do.
I saw girl talk at Lollapalooza actually one time. It was crazy. Like, I had no idea who he was, but like it was, and he was at like one of the smaller stages too, but like he attracted such a huge crowd like in that moment. It was, what's he doing these days? I hope he's all right.
Yeah, me too. I really like.
He's all right too. Yeah.
When I used to work at the cafe that Tyler met me in, like sometimes when I work in the kitchen, the guys who worked up there always had the hip hop stations on. Yeah. And there would always be a moment where I'd be like doing some prep or whatever, and I'd hear the original bit of something that was sampled in a girl talk song, and I'd kind of like sit up like a meerkat. Like, now I know. Okay.
Yeah. Oh man, that was a time when girl talk was really popular among my friends. I really enjoyed that, and my dad got really into mashups too. You know, he was really. You would never. I mean, you've met my father over the airwaves, Matt. You would never expect girl talk to be something that's part of his quiver.
Hey, it's a banger, man. It transcends the generations.
It kind of does, yeah. It's the great unifier, maybe, is dance music.
You know, re-listening to it this time right now as we are recording this episode, I'm struck, and I'm surprised we've gone this long without dropping this. And since we're talking to a real live English person here, I feel like we can finally ask this question. I don't think that like latter day Radiohead would exist without Massive Attack existing, which leads me to like, A, do you agree, Matt? And B, just out of curiosity, what is the perception of Radiohead over there as opposed to over here?
Great question. I'm probably the wrong person to ask because I am a Radiohead fan on the basis that I have 2 of their records, and I love those records, and I've never really listened further. I've heard a little bit, but like perhaps this is something I need to revisit, right? Because around what were the 2, Kid A, Amnesiac times, I wasn't ready for those records, and I've never kind of gone back to them. Although I might be wrong, it is on shuffle on my phone quite a lot, and every time that drops, that's another very menacing sounding kind of sample heavy track. I agree. Massive Attack belong in that category with Radiohead of transcendent British artists, and when you look at, especially, it's so difficult to separate British art and music of the 90s, especially from the Britpop Cool Britannia era, which is something that people kind of distance themselves from as if it's radioactive at this point, because it's so lazy and there's so much terrible music and terrible art and like, you know, quite irresponsible cultural shifts that happen around then. Things like Radiohead, things like Massive Attack, Portishead, Spiritualized, that kind of more, they were all out around the same time, but they were never part of, like, Suede, Elastica you could probably put in there as well, because those 2 bands especially are charged with kickstarting the Britpop movement, but what their music is and what they were doing had nothing to do with, you know, this kind of 60s revivalist, weird kind of like mods and rocker type thing that was sweeping the nation. In terms of like perceptions of Radiohead, they're still like regarded as, you know, one of the best British bands out there. I don't think it's probably any different to the American perception of Radiohead.
Interesting.
Do they seem to you distinctly British when you listen to their music?
Yeah, well, yes and no. I mean, like the early stuff. I mean, I feel like Pablo Honey feels British to me, whatever that means. And then like as they've morphed. I mean, now that, you know, Tom and Johnny are with the Smile, that feels like that. Now they don't even sound like Radiohead. That first Smile album sounded a lot like Radiohead, but the second one sounds like their own thing now. I mean, I think even though I didn't know as much about Britpop at the time, I knew enough to know that, like, no, Radiohead's not part of that. But I mean, I think right now, I mean, I don't know what you think about this, Tyler, but I feel like in America, they're still regarded as a good band, but amongst, like, it's more niche over here, I think.
Right,
it's
perhaps.
not like mainstream acceptance, unless you're like writing for a music publication, in which case you're sort of obligated to be like, oh my God, Radiohead's amazing. And just everyone sort of goes along with it. But I don't know if it has the same acclaim or appeal over here as it might over there.
They seemed unbothered by all of the oasis of it all, is my perception. At least Liam had a lot to say about the kind of music that I don't know if Noel did as well, about the kind of music that they were making, and it never really seemed like they were all that bothered by it, which indicates to me a separation, and which I think is probably speaks in Radiohead's favor in some ways, a pure creative drive, perhaps. If you want to extrapolate it to that level.
Yeah, I think Radiohead exists in that pantheon of bands like Pink Floyd and David Bowie, rather than in the pantheon of bands like the Rolling Stones and Led Zeppelin. Gotcha.
That distinction absolutely makes sense to me. Yeah. And I was thinking the same thing, Michael, when we were listening to that song. I was like, we do not get Kid A without Blue Lines. There's no chance.
Or even some of the like later, like some of the Johnny Greenwood adding strings to things, like just like the use of the orchestra in that case. A fun fact I discovered doing research is that Mushroom had to sell, I believe, his car to pay for they didn't know how much the orchestra was going to cost. And so he had to sell his car to pay for the orchestra on this album. So
it's crazy to think you get to that point in a creative process where you're like, no, this is the right move, is to sell my car. Is that I know that the stakes are high enough that I need to do this, that I need to liquidate this asset. That speaks highly to your confidence in whatever endeavor you are undertaking.
You clearly had a lot of confidence in the endeavor and also in the British public transport system.
Yeah. See, you couldn't do that where I'm living right now. Or you could, but it would be a massive inconvenience.
Massive inconvenience, Tyler?
Oh goodness. Okay. Should we talk standards for perfection then?
Let's do it.
Before we get into that, I remember Spiritualized was on your list as well. And Spiritualized is definitely niche over here. I don't know. I'm not even very familiar with Spiritualized myself, but they've algorithmically showed up for me a few times now, and I've appreciated what I've heard. You're a fan, huh?
Yeah, they've got a record that came out in the late 90s called Ladies and Gentlemen Floating in Space, which I found out about because it's kind of like a bit of a concept album, but its packaging, it was packaged like a packet of drugs, like a pill packet, like prescription drugs with the braille on the top and the kind of the dosage of how much you were supposed to take. Now it seems a little bit kind of like, it says like take orally, but AU orally, right? That's clever. But yeah, it was,
It's good.
It's an astonishing record, and one that has that cinematic in the non-lazy way of applying to it feel. And there's also one of the really, really brutally sad song on there called Broken Heart. And this is why I didn't chime with it back then, because it is an absolutely introspective, reflective record. And it's if Britpop was the party, Ladies and Gentlemen, We Are Floating in Space is the hangover, and the looking at yourself in the kind of coke-stained mirror the next morning with blood streaming down your face. That's exactly what that record is. And I mean, do you know Spacemen 3? That was the band the guy was in before Spiritualized, and there's a lot about his past in that band. And yeah, it's a great record. Check it out.
You get another 20,000 points for Ladies and Gentlemen is the Hangover, and I'm going to remember that. Describing an album like a hangover it doesn't make you really want to go experience it, but I think I understand what that experience might why it might be valuable. We're getting sidetracked again. You've already spoken very beautifully about how kind of like what tied the albums together that you did put before us, and I think. And I think we didn't call the policeman because there was something about the list, right, that felt very complete.
Right,
I don't know if I don't want to speak for you, Michael, but the list did feel very rounded in terms of those albums that you chose. So if you want to come at it from this angle, I suppose, having already spoken about it, what were the standards for perfection? What additional standards were for perfection unified the albums that you recommended to us?
That's a great question. Thank you for asking. I don't believe in perfection in terms of like an attainable goal.
Great.
And I've never enjoyed the pursuit of perfection, and I don't believe perfect things exist. And I feel like chasing perfection is artistic folly. And I remember there's a really good episode of the WTF podcast with Bryan Cranston. Yeah. And I think Maron asks him something along the lines of like, how do you feel that now you've made it? And Cranston's like, what do you mean? I haven't made it. I'm just successful. That's not the same thing. And I remember like the way he said it was like the way I think about perfection. Like if you get perfection, like what are you supposed to do with it? Like you've achieved it. What do you do now? Just never do anything ever again. Like you always should be striving for something. And if you believe in perfection, you believe that it's attainable, then you'll get whatever that is and nothing more. So I don't believe there are any perfect albums. And the albums that I sent you on that list, like they are all just perfect for a thing in context. And Blue Lines, to me, and the idea of being perfect is the perfect treatise on a scene, a sound, a place, and those people who made it at that time. It's this perfect crystallization of all that coming together for something unique that exists just there. And it's got its imperfections. It's got things that are great about it. It's got things that, you know, will rub people the wrong way. It's got things that will make people's eyes kind of bulge in their head and their hearts sing. All that kind of cliched stuff is in there. And it's all drawn from all these kind of imperfect elements from all these imperfect people, but it just makes this one perfect thing. And in that perfect sense, in the context of the thing, it being made by those people in that place at that time.
Yeah.
Yeah, and somehow they managed to make it happen without, I mean, I know you addressed this earlier, like it while it is of that time and of this group of people, it's not, it doesn't feel dated in the same way that a lot of like, you know, time capsule albums can feel like, where it's like, oh, this is decidedly an 80s album and it sounds like it, the production sounds like it. I mean, it's maybe because they remixed it or remastered or whatever the proper term is, remastered specifically, but like while it is specific to that time period, it does, I could pick this up now. I could play this for my students and they wouldn't be like, what the hell is this? They'd be kind of like, it has enough connection to things happening now.
Well, because it sounds retro, but only in the sense that what you're saying, it sounds like you could put it on and somebody would think that they are copying Massive Attack, right? If somebody didn't know that this was Massive Attack, this could sound like a band of 19-year-old TikTokers that are trying to make a trip hop style album. It so defines that. I think that's a really well made point about it crystallizing something. That perfection has to crystallize something that it can only exist in a moment. It can't live, right? Like I guess it does live, right? Its perfection lives on.
This is something I feel like I'm kind of so dear listeners, I'm handling this week's Back to One segment, and I'm sort of struggling with this idea that, you know, we have this venture where we ask people to talk about albums that mean something to them. We ask them to use words to articulate how they feel about something or what it has accomplished. When honestly, the thing that I love about music the most, and even music videos too, is the fact that like their effect is ineffable. And so like, I mean, I think that's maybe kind of the thing I always struggle with this whole podcast, frankly, is that like when you try and apply words to things, like what does that do? And yeah, like I guess if something were perfect, we're sort of asking ridiculous questions when I think about it, Tyler. Like with this podcast,
we're ridiculous people. That's okay.
Yeah, you guys need to stop doing this to people. Just stop bringing them in and asking them this. It's cruel.
It is cruel. Well, I guess that leads you to the thing. It leads you to the. I mean, I have plenty of people who I've talked about this venture with, and they're like, I don't intellectualize music like that. And I'm like, well, first of all, it's an interesting pin to put on yourself, right? That you are not the kind of person that intellectualizes art, which I think we all do in some respect, in some way in our lives. But it's also like, is the act of articulating it vocally fundamentally reductive, right? Like, are we losing we are losing something from the piece of art itself in the act of speaking about it, in the act of trying to translate it into another form. Would either of you agree or disagree with that?
It's interesting that you say that, because I feel a lot. This is why I love your show so much, because there are times when you speak about albums, and I'll bring out when you talked about A Ghost Is Born by Wilco, right?
Yeah.
Listening to Tyler speak about the album, I was like, I love that record, right? Mm-hmm. I cannot talk about that album in these terms. I just can't. I don't think it's intellectualizing it, but that is Tyler's distillation of that record and what it means.
Yeah.
Then you listen, and that is equally as good as, I'm sorry, I forget the person's name. They did Rumors by Fleetwood Mac, and they were talking
Jess
about
Winningham, friend.
They were talking about, listen to it in the car and the family, and this kind of like long emotional journey. And I'm like, that's why this show is great, right? Because both of these things are super, super interesting. One of my favorite episodes was the Erotica Madonna episode you had on this season.
Yeah.
Yep.
Love that. That's an album that, I think that's not a very good album, right?
It's not.
But
it's not.
And that wasn't a mega fan trying to defend an album that's not very good. That's someone talking about their relationship with an album and an artist, and a body of work through the lens of this one specific album, and it's fascinating. And that's why this show's good. None of us can talk about things in the same way. I get this way when I read books. Like, people ask me about my favorite books, and then they'll go, "What do you like about it?" And I'll be like, just reading it and think it was great. I don't have the vocabulary. I like film. I do 100%. Right. I studied film at university, worked in film for a long time, and did film criticism a lot. I can articulate that. I can't articulate music in the same way. It might sound like I can, but I had to make lots of notes on this. I had to really think about it. I don't like thinking too hard. And that's why, like, I think on the Avalanches episode, again, I don't know the guy's name, but he talked about like snark being this kind of dominant journalistic force of talking about music in the early aughts, right? Mm-hmm. And it's because people didn't really understand how to intellectualize thoughts about music in that way. So and I certainly didn't. Whenever I wrote a music column for anything, it was just from this kind of, I know way too much about this than you guys, and I'm just going to make fun of it, I'm above this kind of thing, right? God, where am I going with this? But yes, we relate to and talk about and share our experiences of music and art and culture in so many different ways, and they're all equally as valid. So if someone says, I don't intellectualize music like that, or I can't, it's just like that person can totally have a conversation about music, but it would just be not in the terms that they think is intellectual, and they're both equally the same.
You're giving them so much credit when I'm just like, oh, come on, this is legit. This is a legit venture.
Yeah, Tyler should be on trial, not Blue Lines by Massive Attack.
Put me up there. Don't attack the music. I'll give you another 50,000 points for recontextualizing those who don't intellectualize.
Yeah, and also it builds into that idea that there is in some way shame of talking about things in an intellectual way.
Yes.
That's not in and of itself a shameful thing to do, but like people feel insecure about being smart, I guess, or looking clever.
And this country is becoming a shameful thing to be intellectual about things. So.
It is a thing. That's a genuine cultural force, and the one that's dangerous. I think. I mean, it's easy for us to say, right? We're just the guys hanging out talking about music, but like, it's a political, it's like a political wave. It's a thing that happens in your conversations you have in your everyday life. That's sort of like intellectual versus non-intellectual ways of reacting to things. But what you were saying earlier about the way in which music kind of reawakened for you in your late 20s, I think there's a way of accessing your intellect along with your heart that I think is I guess to me, what I think of when people say emotional intelligence, right? Accessing music with emotional intelligence is what we hope for, and the ability to be vulnerable about about the way that something made you feel, some piece of art, some random album. Why should it make me feel so much? It's hard to figure out.
It's like when you guys ask guests all the time, like, are you a music or a lyrics person? Like, the music is very much the heart, and the lyrics is very much the brain, right? The intellect, I guess. And the best music is when it gets both those things going. But like, there's absolutely no shame in just one, like either or, like popping off in your synapses.
All right, Matt, then, we have to ask you our newest question, our newest bit, if you will, which is the Billy Crudup question. Sounds like you know Almost Famous. It's one of my favorite films. One I don't think about like regularly, but whenever it comes up, I'm like, oh shit, I love that film. At the end, Patrick Fugit's character asks him, "What do you love about music?" We want to ask you that question. We'd hit record and let you speak for hours, but we're gonna put a little structure on this. In a sentence or two, what do you love most about music?
I thought about this and prepared for this, your newest segment. There was an interview a few years ago with one of my favorite British filmmakers called Shay Meadows, who made the films Dead Man's Shoes, This Is England, that kind of stuff. I worked with him once. Lovely guy.
Awesome.
He said that when he was talking about music, his soundtracks for his films were always really good. He said something about like when he was listening to music when he had a broken heart. And he said it was for the first time he realized that the music understood him and not the other way around. And that has always stuck with me. And when I'm talking about the 27-year-old Matt Risby, this person, didn't even understand the music. And at 27, the music understood me, and then I understood the music after that. And, you listen to things that, like, you feel like this song is about you. No one ever has. It's just, engaging with art in any way is like hearing someone else say, yes, someone else feels as good or as bad as you in this particular situation. And you feel like this song is for or about you. And music is just the quickest and easiest way, because there's just so much of it. And there's so many different types of it that connect with different people, that if you're open to that experience and open to that, which I wasn't before and am now, then that is just a wonderful thing. And that is what music means to me.
We have to break new ground with that. Matt, I think you are going to be the first person on this podcast to receive 1 billion points for anything.
That is a lot of points.
It's an unethical amount of points, but I'm going to
there doesn't need to be any billionaires.
Then you're just going to have to give them all away.
I will I'll happily give these points away. I will redistribute them in my socialist utopia.
Please do. We'll join you. I'm in. Let's do it. That was so well said. To the point where I guess we just got to go to the board. I mean, it's that time. You gave us the perfect entree to it, Matt. This is and always has been about winning, as I'm sure you know. As somebody who has so generously spent their time listening to us talk. It sounds like you have spent literal hours listening to us talk. And so let's see how you did, and let's see if you've done enough for this album to enter the Pantheon. Starting with the 1 billion points I just gave you for the line, "The music understood you. You didn't understand the music," which is just so beautiful. 50,000 points for recontextualizing the people who claim to not intellectualize music. They do in their own way. I made note of your points about a perfect album being the perfect crystallization of a moment in time, a group of people, a set of circumstances, and its ability to capture that. 20,000 points for Ladies and Gentlemen, ... by Spiritualized being the hangover if the rest of Britpop was the party. I gave you 600,000 points for correcting us on the Girl Talk mention, saying that you are the second invocation of Girl Talk after our good friend Evan Saudi, who Evan and you would get along. You would be thick as thieves. We have to make that happen. 100,000 points for the city of Bristol. Cannot wait to visit there someday. Seems like my kind of town.
Oh, it is.
20,000 points for them talking about, was it the Colston? Was that the slave Colston? Yeah. For them yeeting Colston into the sea. Good riddance. The statue of him. 30,000 points for describing the British as, or at least the English,
Oh yeah, the English. I don't want to bring the Scottish and Welsh into this.
Yeah. So this is specifically the English.
Yeah.
Being unimaginative, alcohol dependent, repressed racists. And I'll let you claim that. 500,000 points, or I think it was actually 5 million points for the tricky pun. I can't remember the context exactly. I'll enjoy revisiting it during the editing process, but you get 5 million points for that pun. I give you 30 million points for your the story you told about being a musical late bloomer, and the catalyst that was you're agreeing to be on this podcast, leading you down a musical path of reflection. The fact that it caused that for you is sort of like the synthesis of why we want to do this, I think, if I may speak so boldly. So I'm very glad that you were given that opportunity. Add all to that 6 that you gave Michael for his. Are they points? Are they coconuts? We don't know, but you gave him 6.
Yeah. And you earned every single one of those 6, Michael.
I'll take them.
So all those together is a pretty damn strong board. But as you know, it all comes down to one guy. Michael gets to make the final determination. Michael, tell us, is Blue Lines by Massive Attack a perfect album? Does it go to 11?
I mean, I think I want to applaud the care that you put into answering our first question. I mean, that felt like back to one level reflection, sort of the storytelling going on there. Also want to shout out the fact that I too directed my now husband in a play. And that's how we met. So I mean, like, what I'm saying is basically you won the case very early on in this whole conversation. Yes, Massive Attack's Blue Lines may enter the Pantheon. It goes to 11.
Yes, my job is done. Although I didn't know if I was supposed to be on the defense or the prosecution, but I'm happy that it's in.
It's kind of both in this context. You're a little bit. You have to have 2 hats or 2 wigs, I guess, in your situation.
Yeah.
So you have 1 wig for defense and 1 for prosecution. You just swap back and forth.
So, Matt, we asked you to pick a standout track, but we too picked out a standout track. But you already know that because you've listened to our podcast. You know where this is going. And so, would you like to know what our standout track was?
Oh, would I ever?
Well, originally we were thinking about doing Him and the Big Wheel.
Him and the Big Wheel, yeah.
But when right before you got on our call here, I realized then that's 2 tracks that don't feature any of the boys, and so we feel we're going to give the listeners a good, a more balanced reflection of what Massive Attack is all about. We got to get the boys in here somehow. So we've opted to go with the first track that they ever put down, essentially, which is Daydreaming.
This, I felt like, gives a different flavor to some of the strengths that are in this. And I think it's a good opportunity for us to choose contrasts, show the different style that a band can bring out. So it was hard to pick, but you have an embarrassment of riches as you've so described. What do you think of this song, Matt?
It's weird that it was one of the singles. It doesn't stand out to me as a single. I personally prefer, if you're looking for an example of all, I mean, this isn't me choosing this, but of all of the boys on it, then Blue Lines is my pick.
Yeah,
but,
up there too.
Yeah, the Daydreaming is a really, and it's got that. There's a few songs at that tempo on the record that you need as a kind of like a step back, but they also managed to retain that menacing air that you're talking about. Daydreaming got a really weird beat to it. There's almost like this kind of like tubular beat. It's very strange. It's an odd sounding single, and in fact they all are. I can't believe that any of these made radio play. But no, it's a great track. I don't think there are any duff tracks on this album, except there's possibly one I like less than the others. But I think Daydream is a great choice.
Yeah, it's a little more raw too, I think, and also, like, if I'm not mistaken, this is also the track where they say some not so great things about Maggie Thatcher, which I'm okay with.
Yeah, and Maggie this, Maggie that. Maggie means inflation. Is that's the rhyme, isn't it?
I think so. Yeah.
It's great. It's great to see you get an opportunity for so much of the energy is carried musically in this. That these lines kind of cut through. The specificity is a credit to this song. Matt, this has been such a privilege to speak to you. It's one of those things. It just warms my heart that to know that you have supported the pod, and to know that we have somebody out there so far away listening, and great to have this friendship from across, halfway across the globe. So glad you could make it today.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've been championing your podcast to all my friends, and like I've got a whole bunch of my friends listen to this podcast and really enjoy it. And the amount of investment from my friends in what I was going to choose to put forward. A couple of friends who would ask me every time I saw them, "Have you narrowed it down yet?" And I'm like, "Dude, man, I'm at like 30 records at this point." And then when I sent you the 10 or whatever it was, I immediately was like, "Oh, now there's 10 I actually completely forgotten about that all could have made it in here." It was just, oh god. But no, it's been a pleasure to be on, and I will happily bang the drum for This One Goes to 11. I think it's a great show, and you guys do great work.
Thanks, man. Well, we hope to have you back at some point.
I can't go through that again. It's too emotional.
We'll find a way. You could. Well, we'll talk about it later. Anyway, Matt, thanks so much. So great to meet you, dear listeners. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode. Yeah, that's it. We'll see you next week.
Bye.
Bye.